It's really wonderful to have so many of you here tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. We are delighted to be launching Pieter du Toit's illuminating new book, The Dark Prince. I know that is an obvious pun, but I really did want to use that word. I think this is a book that we all need to read if we care about the future of this country, and I'd like to congratulate Pieter on this compelling investigation into Paul Mashatile, and also to thank you for your relentless contribution to journalism and to transparency over the years in this country. This is Pieter's fourth book. Yes, I think you should give him a clap. No, the clapping's for you. And we are delighted to be finally hosting him here at Love Books. I don't know why we've never had Pieter for a launch here before, but welcome, and it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for being here. Thanks, as always, are due to Jonathan Ball Publishers, many of you of whom are here tonight. They really are the best team in town. We love working with them. They have been the publishers of all of Pieter's books, and of course they're helping to pay for the wine and food tonight. So thank you to everyone from Jonathan Ball. Just a little bit of biography about Pieter before we get started. He's a journalist at News 24, where as assistant editor, he oversees the investigative team and writes a weekly column on politics and society. He's the author of 4 other best-selling titles, Enemy of the People, which he wrote with Adrian Basson, the Stellenbosch Mafia and the ANC Billionaires, both of which continue to sell years after they've been published, which is quite unusual, I must say. And his most recent book, which I think was last year, The Supercar Race. Chatting to Pieter tonight, and we are very grateful to you, Mphumelelo, for stepping in at literally the very last minute for this, is Mphumelelo Mkhabela. Mphumelelo is a political analyst and a columnist for News 24. He's a former editor of the Daily Dispatch and the Sowetan, and he served as chairman of SALEF, which is the South African National Editors Forum. He's also the author of a book called The Enemy Within, which is a look at corruption in the ANC. And we have that for sale here as well tonight. Thank you so much, and over to the two of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate, and good evening to everyone, including my secret timekeeper, whose name I shall not mention. All right, it's wonderful to be here. I had to read Pieter's book as if I was preparing for matric exams, which are starting when? Today. So I had to read it overnight. Yeah, but thanks for that. I always wonder how Pieter is able to produce so fast. I mean, he's so prolific. It's amazing. And I'm privileged to launch for the third time. I launched the last 2 of his books, and this is the third one. But today, by accident. Previously, it was planned. But nonetheless,
Mpumi, thanks.
I appreciate the opportunity.
No, thank you. And Mpumi was a colleague of mine in Parliament. I've got great respect for him. He's certainly one of the smartest analysts I know in the country. So thanks for doing this, Mpumi. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Pieter. You know, many moons ago, there was a book published by Arthur Capel-Jones, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. The book lovers would know. It was a novel about Jan Smuts. It was about when Smuts goes. And from then on, a lot of people took that theme, like as in what happens when a supposedly great leader leaves. So a lot of books were written about when so-and-so goes. The last one I remember was written by Ralph Mateja, who's a fellow political analyst. The book was titled When Zuma Goes. So now...
And there was When Mandela Goes as well.
Oh, yes.
Written by Lester Venter, I think.
When Mandela Goes, yeah. Now, today, Pieter has produced something which, if I had an alternative title, I would call When Paul Mashatile Comes. Why? Why, Pieter? Why when somebody comes? Why don't you write about when Cyril goes?
That's a great question, Mpumi. Thanks. And first, thanks, Kate, and thanks to Book Lounge. It's great being here. I also... book lovers. Love Books, Book Lounge, Love Books. Thank you, Kate. It's great being here. And thanks to Jonathan Ball and the team from JBP who is here tonight. So Paul Mashatile is... I first wrote about him in 2006, Mpumi. I discovered in the newspaper archives when he was MEC for Economic Development in Gauteng. And I wrote about him in the context of the Auberge Michel restaurant in Sandton, where he spent tens of thousands of 2006 rands on a number of parties. And you know, as journalists, we track these individuals across many years. And, you know, he never was a significant or a major political figure in the ANC, always a provincial don, as it were, in Gauteng. But over the last 5, 6, 7 years, he's certainly emerged as one of the most important players in the ANC, certainly since 2022 when he became deputy president. Before that, he was treasurer as well. So the motivation for this was to I think, you know, it's a polemic. It's not an authorized biography or an official biography by any stretch of the imagination. It's a polemic, and the purpose is to warn against someone that I think, Mpumi, there are many characteristics which is reminiscent of Jacob Zuma. Both of them used a province as their basis of power, both of them at the center of wide networks of patronage, and those networks of patronage have supported his lifestyle. His family have benefited from that, just like Jacob Zuma. So it's a warning, I think. It's a warning to tell people that should he become ANC leader and should the ANC remain the biggest formation in a coalition government in future, you know, we might sit with Paul Mashatile as head of state.
Yeah, but there's an irony in that, because while you seem to suggest that we certainly would be in trouble, we would perhaps regard the Zuma-Gupta era as a dry run if Paul were to become president. But at the same time, Paul was very critical of that Zuma-Gupta era. And you say he acknowledged, as you analyze, he acknowledged that actually that corruption of that era was responsible for the downfall, or should I say the decline of the ANC. So how could he be so bad when he acknowledged that there was bad things that happened in the party, and in fact, he fought Jacob Zuma?
Mpumi, he acknowledged that because the Jacob Zuma networks of patronage and corruption was threatening the Mashatile networks in Gauteng. So it's about networks of patronage, it's about factionalism in the ANC, and Mashatile did not criticize Jacob Zuma because of a position of principle. He didn't criticize Zuma because he was angry about the ANC being given away to the Guptas. Or because the Guptas were busy repurposing state-owned companies between 2013 and 2018. He was doing it because there was faction fighting in the ANC. Zuma was threatened by Gauteng because Gauteng is historically in the ANC has not been the easiest of province for an ANC leader to maintain their support. And Zuma wanted to take Mashatile out to ensure that Gauteng keeps on supporting him. But for Mashatile, it was a threat to his influence in Gauteng. You know, we talk about the so-called Alex Mafia, which is his principal network around him. You know, and these networks, whilst Mashatile carried enormous weight in Gauteng ever since the early 2000s, when he became deputy chairperson of the province, later on chairperson, briefly served as premier. I mean, this province, the riches that this province holds, is a big prize for these ANC factions. So, yes, he survived Zuma, he fought back against Zuma, but not because of his principled position against corruption, because his networks felt threatened.
But if he is going to be the bad guy, like Zuma, whom he felt he was a threat to his own interest, could you say, therefore, that he is himself not the reflection of his own self-interest?
I think he is a reflection of his own self-interest, but that self-interest is not the ANC's interest in Mpumi. And this is what's so remarkable of what the ANC have become. It's so easy, actually, for the ANC, as still the preeminent political formation in this country, to win votes.
Yeah.
Just do your job properly. You know, fight back against corruption. Enable a growing economy, ensure service delivery, support the rule of law, support democratic institutions. These are basic governance issues which the ANC could have executed, but which they didn't, which people like Mashatile had, they've been in a position for many years to be able to do that. They haven't done so. So you have to conclude from that it is about self-interest. It is about factional interest. And recently, certainly over the last 18 months, 2 years, I think we've seen an acceleration in resource extraction. And Mashatile comes from that tradition. So if you look at how he lives, his lifestyle, how it's being supported, the way in which these networks function, the way in which he resembles the Zuma era, for me, is quite striking.
We will continue just now. I forgot to mention that in the second part of this interaction, you will get a chance to ask questions. So if you are itching, please keep your question in mind or note it somewhere. You will get a chance. I'll definitely give you a chance. I'm not the one to hog the space. All right, Peter. But the first 5 chapters
were boring
of the book. No, not for somebody who loves history like me. I mean,
Mpumi is a big history guy.
I'm sure Paul himself would not mind the first 4 chapters because you locate him nicely in the historical context of the country and where he, as an individual, fits in there.
I really enjoyed the first, researching the first 5 chapters. It was important for me to locate Paul within this country's history because we cannot get away from our country's history. Paul Mashatile, and that's what, and I'll get back to it now, but that's what makes what Paul Mashatile has become such a travesty for me, and which makes the betrayal so much bigger. So he was born in Verwoerd, South Africa. He was born at the height of Verwoerdian power in South Africa. He was born literally months after Verwoerd led South Africa out of the Commonwealth, Mpumi, which you know very well. And he was a teenager during the years of John Foster's hardline crackdown on the anti-apartheid formations. And then he was such a major figure in Alex in the fight against apartheid in the 1980s. He was one of these individuals that invested so much and literally risked life and limb to fight back against the Caspers and the tear gas.
And spent 4 years in detention without trial.
Without trial, 4 years. And he was eventually released from Diepkloof prison, also known as Sun City, south of Joburg, after partaking in a hunger strike. So, he only was able to finish his matric at 21 because of all the violence in townships, the fights with the police and special branch and so on and so forth. So he grew up at the tail end of the fight against apartheid. So he felt it close to his body. So I enjoyed researching that, and I have to say I enjoyed going to the Wits archives to find out more about where Mashatile found himself in the early 1990s after the ANC were unbanned. And it's a wonderful thing going through the archives at Wits, and I went through Barbara Hogan's personal papers where, it's fascinating to work through those archives where you find mentions of individuals like Mashatile in a meeting of the ANC PWV region in March 1990, a month after Mandela was released. How they had to set up new structures in Gauteng, how he worked very closely with Kgalema Motlanthe, who was then with NUM, how he was part of a decision of the ANC's regional executive in the old PWV region, where they had to go to Winnie Mandela to tell her that she's going to have to recuse herself because she's being accused of murder and all manner of other crimes. So it was fascinating to go onto that trail, and it was fascinating using those archives because not a hell of a lot is known about his early years. And yes, I tried to locate him there because that's where he comes from. And it obviously played a role in his political consciousness, Mpumi.
But also interesting for me is how somebody who lived in a community that was a victim of forced removals during apartheid in that farm that you described, that community was evicted and many black people, some of them ended up in Alex and other so-called locations. And that person now rises post-94 to become MEC for human settlements. And now he has an opportunity to deal with some of those apartheid legacy issues of homelessness, of lack of housing, and all of that. And he had actually lived in Alex, which, even though it was regarded as a better in terms of property acquisitions for black people, but it was nonetheless over time became squalor. But now he becomes MEC for housing, in charge of the housing portfolio. You then would expect that he would then rise to the occasion, knowing very well where he comes from, and make sure that he governs the department in a proper way.
So he becomes MEC for housing in 1999. One of the big projects that he tackles first up is the so-called Alexandra Renewal Project, the ARP project, which was a flagship project not only for the Gauteng provincial government or the Gauteng Provincial Department of Housing, but for national government. I think Thabo Mbeki even opened when they launched the Alexandra Renewal Project, Thabo Mbeki as president was there. I think Mbeki launched the project. So it was a flagship project, and it was an opportunity for a son of Alex, in Paul Mashatile, to try and improve the conditions of the place where he came from. But the Alexandra Renewal Project was an absolute disaster. The Human Rights Commission instituted an investigation years after that, condemning the way in which the Gauteng provincial government went about its business under the leadership of Paul Mashatile. So that's an example of, and Mpumi, when I did the book, and when you write a book, it sometimes takes on a life of its own when you start writing the actual words, when you put that on paper, like you very well know. And it was disappointing for me to see that someone like Mashatile, who came from Alex, who had access to resources, who could really have made a difference to Alex. And whenever you take the hard train to ORT and you cross the bridge to Rhodesfield and you see how Alex looks, Mashatile had the opportunity to change something, and he didn't take it. And so there are two tracks, I think, to this book. One is, the patronage politics, of which he is a central part. But also the other track is what a poor elected official he's been over the years. I mean, he could have done something with Alex. He could have made that the touchstone of something big. He failed to do that.
But I also pick up from your research, although you don't comment about this, but I can make an opinion out of it, that nowhere in your research do you find that he had an opportunity to get high-level education after matric. There was an attempt when he was in detention to register for a law degree at UNISA. I think before that there was an attempt for him to do some degree, but I don't find anywhere where he had the privilege of being educated at a high level. Isn't that perhaps one of the weaknesses that perhaps might have made him to be what he was later on, which may not be his own making, or something like that?
Look, I think, Mpumi, when I did research for ANC billionaires, I spent a lot of time, or conducted many interviews with Trevor Manuel, who was Minister of Finance. And it was fascinating to listen to him when he talks about when the ANC came back into the country after 1990. When they found, the country that the ANC found when they returned after exile was a completely different place to the 1960s when the ANC was banned. Obviously, you had people internally in the UDF who had the opportunity to study further. Trevor Manuel was someone that couldn't do it, for example, but many did. And what Trevor Manuel said was they found a sophisticated economy, capitalist economy, a sophisticated society which they now had to lead, but they were lacking in the skills to be able to do that. And many of them were put on those Harvard courses, IMF courses. Many of them went to study. During exile, many ANC leaders were identified by the ANC leadership for further studies. So Tito Mboweni studied, I think, law and labor law at the University
Economics,
of Lesotho. Many of them did go and study. So I think it's certainly a gap in Paul Mashatile's makeup. He could have done something. He was still very young when he became an MEC. He was born in 1961. He became an MEC at the age of 33, 35. So there were opportunities, I think, while he was busy being MEC of roads, public transport, later on safety and security, a position he took from Jesse Duarte. to study further. He didn't do that. And I think, later in the book, I write about a dinner that he had with 100 business leaders at the JSE. And our colleague Carol Payton writes that many business leaders who left that meeting were disappointed in Mashatile's lack of insight into how the economy works. Either a lack of insight, they said, or a lack of interest being shown. So it is a problem, and I think it is lacking in his makeup. But like you say, much of this is not a fault of his own. I mean, he was 18 in 1979. He was 18 in 1979. He was shifted around between Alex at Ridgeville, where his parents lived, so it was an unstable personal life. And he only finished his matric at 21 in Alex at a Catholic school. So, the struggle presented those challenges, and I think, it's one of the legacies of apartheid, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, in the bigger leadership categorizations in the ANC, you often hear of people that came from exile, as you correctly say, and people that were so-called inzals, like people like Trevor Manuel, who never went into exile, but they were here, and most of them, they were the leaders of the UDF in the 80s. And Paul Mashatile's organization in Alex was affiliated to the UDF, as you correctly point out in the book. Now we have a situation where if Paul becomes president, he will be the second person after Ramaphosa to have been an exile. Never went to exile because Thabo Mbeki had been to exile, Zuma had been to exile. Mandela was a different exile. He was in prison on Robben Island. He was different exile. Yeah. So, but people, whenever there's a debate in the ANC, some people say, the exiles are secretive in nature. They believe in conspiracy theories. Would you say that Mashatile, in that categorization, would be a typical continuation of the Cyril Ramaphosa type UDF, or is it a totally different character?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer. The exiles, as you correctly point out, and there's a wonderful book, I don't know if it's on the shelves here, written by Stephen Ellis called External Mission, which I think, if you want to understand the ANC, is one of the very best books to read, because it explains to you what the ANC had become during the exile years. They had become paranoid. They were a centrally directed, a centrally led organization. They were very close to the Eastern Bloc countries, and that all played a role in the dominance of the ANC when they came back and fused with the exiles. Whether Paul Mashatile would be a continuation, for me, it's difficult. I don't think Mashatile is a typical politician. I don't think he's someone that you can identify certain policy positions with. It's very unclear what he stands for, what his beliefs are, what his central political drivers are, what his ideology is, apart from the stock standard ANC talking points, which is prepared for him by speechwriters. So, at least with the previous ANC leaders and presidents, we had a very good idea what they stood for. Even though you might not agree with it, we knew what Mbeki stood for. We knew to a large extent, what Zuma stood for. We've got a good idea what Ramaphosa wanted. But what Mashatile wants, what are his central beliefs? What has he achieved as an elected politician? Is there a signature policy position which he's driven over 20 years or 15 years or 5 years? There isn't any. So I don't think he'll be a continuation of Ramaphosa, no. I think he'll be a continuation of Gauteng leadership, rooted in networks like the Alex Mafia, and focused on what is important for his faction in this province.
But I was surprised to find you have a chapter called the Mashatile Doctrine. So surely he has a philosophical outlook.
I tried to identify stuff, and because I thought to myself, when I'm writing this book, I need to give the reader an idea of what might come and what might happen if Mashatile becomes president. As far as the economic doctrine is concerned, he's a strong adherent of BEE, as the president said today. after the DA announced their BE proposals yesterday. So that's a big cornerstone of his beliefs. He does believe, nominally at least, if you look at his speeches, and speeches are written by speech writers and a whole team of aides at the union buildings and at Luthuli House, he does believe that there's a role for the private sector in conjunction with the public sector. But it's very clear for me, having read a lot of his economics-oriented speeches, that the role of the state remains important for Mashatile. BEE is a cornerstone, but there is a role for the private sector. Then, over the last 18 months, it's been fascinating to see that Mashatile has been given strong and larger responsibilities than Ramaphosa, for example, was ever handed by Zuma. Official visits to Japan, France, China, Britain, envoy to go and see the high priest of capital in London, meeting with Goldman Sachs, meeting with the ratings agency. So that's all happened in the last 18 months. So it does appear to me that he is being prepared for higher honors, that it's almost been a coming out over the last 18 months, driven by the president. What his innermost beliefs are, it remains a mystery, because he's very clever and adept at delivering speeches, but which, and I quote someone from one of your former colleagues in the Sunday Times, I think it was Thabo, or it was Kaifas Khosana, I think, who wrote that, his one and only State of the Province speech as Premier of Gauteng was deathly boring. So what does he believe? It's unclear, and I think that's a problem, because in a vacuum like that, you get influences from outside, and someone like this, who leads an extravagant lifestyle funded by external actors, then it's easy to tailor your beliefs to whomever pays the bills.
But also there's stories about 2 or 3 chapters you dedicate on the recent acquisitions of his, it's not his acquisition. Paul says it's a family properties in here in Gauteng and Cape Town. And the story around these acquisitions of these properties, it seems to me that if he at all he is preparing to rise to the union buildings at the highest level, he believes it's not appropriate for a leader like him to be living an ordinary, humble life. He should begin at least by posture to show that actually he is going up and up. But you have an issue with that, especially because of the way these properties have been acquired.
Mpumi, let me first of all, say that a lot of that, all of that is, that part of the book is due to the work that was done by my colleagues at News 24 in Kyle Cowan, Sipho Mosondo, and Azara Karim. And I have to say that I'm very lucky to be leading the best investigative team in the country. Some of them are here tonight. Thanks, guys. And for the work that you do as well. Well, yes, the facts are that Paul Mashatile lives in a 37 million rand mansion in Waterfall. He lives in a 29 million rand mansion in Constantia. It was bought for him and for his use by his son-in-law, who, whilst Paul Mashatile was MEC, his second stint as MEC for housing in Gauteng, received multi-million rand loans from the same government of which Paul Mashatile was part of. Now, this is but an example of how networks around Mashatile benefited from his political position. It started way back in 2006 when he was MEC for Economic Development, where companies received multi-million rand tenders from the Gauteng provincial government, which then it later emerged that he, via other front companies or other intermediary companies, also owned shares in. His daughter was given employment at some of these companies that received money from the Gauteng provincial government while he was there. He received almost 400,000 rands from a guy called Edwin Sodi, who is one of the biggest tenderpreneurs in the country, who is on trial for corruption in the High Court in Bloemfontein. So yes, I think we need to take an issue with that, because someone whose lifestyle is being supported by other individuals who benefit from the political principles position, we need to question that. And Mashatile took great exception to our reporting on that. It's never been disproven. In fact, in the Parliamentary Register of Members' Interests, he confirmed that those homes are his, for his use. So it's about his lifestyle. It's about who supports his lifestyle. And if you want to be head of state, I think, given our history during state capture and the Zuma years, we need to understand what your sources of income are, your sources of wealth, and who supports your lifestyle. Because it can lead to corruption, at worst, and at the best, inappropriate influence from other quarters. Like we saw with Zuma and Shabir Shaikh, who's now almost a forgotten figure, and certainly Jacob Zuma and the Guptas.
I'll come to the questions now. My last one before I give you an opportunity. Please be ready. Look, should we blame or criticize Paul for this, or should we perhaps target the enabling environment, the environment that enables this type of things to happen? Otherwise, we may be seen to be nitpicking. Why pick on Paul? Okay, yes, there's a justification because he wants to be president. You need to know, we need to know what kind of a character wants to run our country and perhaps set the tone for the rest of society. Yeah. But we also need to look at what kind of environment permits this, that we think it's wrong, but the environment nonetheless permits it.
What's astonishing about this is when you delve back into Paul's history, when you go back to the very first scandals which he was involved in, which, might sound innocuous now, but he had absolutely no regard for his credit card when it was MEC for Finance. And he literally spent hundreds of thousands of rands at some of Sandton's most expensive restaurants, dining out in style, hosting his friends and colleagues, at lavish lunches. Now, in 2006, it might not have sounded like much, but I think it was the start of a culture around Mashatile. If you go even back further, if you go back to the first instances of corruption post-1994, we now laugh at the money that was bandied about. If you think about Sarafina too, or you think about Travelgate, the arms deal is still a massive, looms very large over our politics, with Jacob Zuma still to appear in the High Court very soon. But I think we permitted that as a society. We never, I don't think there was enough pushback, oversight, demand for accountability in the late 1990s or the early 2000s as we should have demanded of our political representatives. Because after that, Mpumi, you know that very well, it kind of became part of our fabric, accepting these kind of things, accepting small instances of corruption as the price of living in this country, or as the price of having stable government. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous, I think, that someone like this think that it's okay to live in a mansion that someone else pays for, but we don't know where the resources come from. I think it's outrageous that we accept that the cost of living in this country or doing business in this country is to pay kickbacks in this ecosystem of resource extraction, this ecosystem of corruption. I think you're absolutely correct. We need to target the system, this enabling system that we've got, but it's not going to change with the politicians that we currently have in executive positions, because the political will simply is not there to change the system, to fight back against corruption. And that's why Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency has been such an enormous disappointment, because it started with promise, but it very quickly petered out. And why? Because if Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC were to fight back, reform, tackle, cut off these networks of extraction, it's going to cut off the ANC's oxygen to survive. I mean, it was only yesterday where they settled outstanding amounts to a service provider that they owed. So they're in perpetual financial dire straits. You've got all these empires with political principles and networks of extraction that rely on this ecosystem to extract money from the state. It gets recycled back to the political principle and those networks. And Mashatile comes from that culture and tradition. It's not going to change under his leadership, and I don't think it's going to change under the current leadership, which is Cyril Ramaphosa.
Well, my comment about that is that I really struggle to reconcile the commitments that the ANC make with its own actions. Yeah. I mean, if you go back to the 2007 elective conference in Polokwane. I mean, those of us who read through this ANC literature, there's a document called Strategy and Tactics.
Yeah.
In there, they say something about how the ANC has to, ANC members and leaders must lead by example. And it says, wherever they are in society, in their official capacities and also in their personal lives, because it is through their conduct that they shape how people perceive the ANC. The ANC shouldn't be a jellyfish whose shape and structure can be, sort of malleable. It shouldn't be an amoeba, in other words. But when you then observe what happens in practice, I always find it difficult to reconcile the two. But anyway, let's leave it there. I want to come to the audience. They should ask you questions, Peter. I'm just standing here as a facilitator.
Thanks, Mpumi.
Anybody who wants to ask questions? Let me start at the back. I'll come back to you because I won't miss you. Yes?
In the 1980s, I actually taught Paul and his fellow members of the Alexandra Youth Congress how to print struggle posters and T-shirts. And Paul was a hell of a nice. In fact, that group was one of the nicest groups that we worked with, the Alexandra Youth Congress. It included Obed Bapela, who's a minister, a deputy minister, a guy called Pat Bunda, who's become incredibly wealthy. I've seen pictures on Facebook with him with Lamborghinis and stuff. But Paul was a really nice guy, and I suppose what I'm interested to know from you is, and you kind of touched on it, is he inherently corrupt or dishonest? I mean, has he become wealthy through deliberate dishonesty? Or has he become victim of this kind of lack of moral or ethical compass that I think has bedeviled a lot of politicians at the moment? And by the way, a fun fact in relation to that is that, I don't know if you have heard of the moral regeneration movement, which was started by a very good person, Mphumelelo Mkhabela, Reverend Mphumelelo Mkhabela. Do you know that automatically the deputy president of the country is the patron of the moral regeneration movement? I just think about that.
Jacob Zuma was that for many years.
I mean, Kgalema Motlanthe was fine, but Jacob Zuma, Didi Mabuza, and now possibly Paul. So, yeah. I mean, I just think that so my issue really is, is Paul, in your view, your investigation, is he inherently a corrupt, dishonest person, or is he just a victim of sort of being a political maneuverer and kind of that?
Thanks for that. Great question. Look, I think I need to be very careful in my colleagues are standing at the back, guys. Take notes and let the lawyers know. I think he's been corrupted. His idea of morals and ethics since coming into power has been corrupted. And I think we've seen that with a number of post-liberation political leaders. And Paul's a shining example of that, unfortunately. Shining is the wrong operative word, but he's a perfect example of that. He grew, and that's why I tried to locate it the way that I did. He fought very hard against apartheid. He felt it on his back. He felt it in his skin. He went to prison. He struggled his whole life through. But the moment that he was given executive power, access to executive authority, access to budgets, access to public resources, I think then his idea of reform, liberation, of transformation, of reconstruction was corrupted in his mind. And Mpumi referred to the Alex Renewal Project. I mean, that was something that he could really have taken to elevate his status if he was thinking about self-interest, but to make a big difference. And he wasn't able to do that. So his whole life has been about a life of excess, a life of vast resources being supported by other people. And really, I think, in a position now where he believes that it's his right to live the way that he does. which is a terribly sad thing for someone that fought against apartheid, fighting back Caspers, fighting back Special Branch, being arrested for 4 years, detention without trial, and turning out this way. I think it's a massive disappointment.
Yeah, but I agree with him on one thing, that Paul is a very nice guy. I actually have met him, and when you have a discussion with people that are warm, nice, kind, just like Zuma, sometimes you don't think someone could do something so different to their personality. I mean, he's a very nice guy. Yeah. That's a thing. Any other question? Yes, I almost omitted you.
I'm Sue Grant Marshall. I interviewed Jeff Wicks. He's somewhere at the back there, he's hiding. And he's part of the Media 24 investigative team. He wrote the book on Babita Diakoran, who went down, always trying to be shy. Is he shy? And in a hail of bullets, because she was beginning to find out what was happening at Tembisa Hospital, which in the end was 2.3 billion. So now, Peter, what I want to know from you, that investigative team, here's Jeff Wicks, I know Adrian Basson has written books, I've interviewed him, but now I won't try and be dramatic, do you fear for your life? Jeff has had threats, have you?
Thanks, Sue. Look, I think the environment in which we operate now is much different to the environment that we operated in 10 years ago. I think it is true that the work that our investigative team does, and almost all of them are here tonight. 10 years ago, during the height of state capture, when we wrote about the Guptas, when we wrote about those networks of extraction, we never felt physically threatened, but I think that has changed over the last 2 years. I think the way in which organized crime has now become intertwined with ANC politics, the way in which organized crime is now part and parcel of resource extraction. You've got middlemen, you've got fixers, you've got political principles. We are, of course, all of us following what's happening in the Madlanga Commission in Parliament as well. So for the first time, I think the work that we do as investigative journalists is starting to carry a physical threat. It is something that we are cognizant of, we are aware of. It's something that didn't happen 10 years ago. I ascribe it to the rise of organized crime and the way in which, or the fact that the ANC are nearing their expiry date. And I think many of these networks are starting to extract or trying to extract as much resources as they can from the system while they can still do it. And I think whistleblowers, forensic auditors, lawyers, and investigative journalists are an impediment to that. And it's something that we 10 years ago wasn't a factor. We are taking it seriously now.
You want to ask a question?
You spoke earlier about how Paul was perhaps left behind in the way he missed out on education. Do you think that morality is distinct from education? And do we hold our politicians to an extremely low standard? And when I talk about that, I'm talking about the picture of Edwin Sony's birthday party.
Great questions, Jeff. Thanks for that. So Jeff asked a question about education and morality. Is education separate from morality? So if you're well educated, I suppose, Jeff, are you a moral person? Does that feed into your morality as a leader? And then secondly, Jeff, your second one again? Oh, do we hold our leaders to a high enough standard? And he was referring to a photograph that News 24 pictured of ANC luminaries around a table with two significant tenderpreneurs. No, Jeff, I don't think education I don't think there's a causal link between education and morality. I mean, we've had wonderful, morally upright leaders throughout history that weren't well educated. So I think it helps certainly to understand the environment in which you're supposed to operate in as an elected official. But I think morals and ethics is something that, comes to you separate from your education. Then do we hold our leaders to a high enough standard? I mean, no, Jeff, absolutely not. I think in this country, people have been voting against their own interests for election after election after election. I mean, in that photograph, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you remember that, we published that photograph of Edwin Sodi's 50th birthday party. Now, Edwin Sodi is one of the country's foremost entrepreneurs, received more than R1 billion in contracts from the Gauteng provincial government, received hundreds of millions of rands from the Free State provincial government in the famous asbestos project that was run by Alex Mafia, and he's now on trial for corruption in the Free State High Court. Also a benefactor of Paul Mashatile. Paul Mashatile has stayed in his Atlantic Seaboard mansion in Cape Town on numerous occasions. Even when the state was busy attaching that mansion, Paul Mashatile still stayed there and argued that he did not see anything wrong with that. Now, again, it's absolutely ludicrous that someone who wants to be head of state defends and maintains a friendship with someone who's stolen billions of rands or illegally acquired billions of rands from the state, from the public purse. That's a problem. And no, Jeff, I don't think we hold our leaders to a high enough standard. And I think we might be moving into an era where people will be starting to vote against those leaders. Well, the fact of the matter is that the ANC lost 17 percentage points at last year's election. And that will only accelerate at next year's municipal election, I think.
And that's the irony of it all, because Paul is one of the people who speak strongly against corruption, spoke strongly against Zuma and the Guptas, even went to, according to your book, even went to Parliament to instigate that if Zuma doesn't resign, he must be recalled.
Yeah. And then they involve themselves in this. I mean, that photograph that we published, you had Kat Matlala and Edwin Sodi around the table, two of the country's biggest and most notorious entrepreneurs and extractors. And then you had Keith Khoza standing behind Edwin Sodi, and Keith Khoza is Paul Mashatile's right-hand man, having a whale of a time. What does that tell you about the links between the union buildings and these networks? They are so intertwined. It's impossible to separate them. I think they're almost one.
Yeah, she's next.
Yeah, I am curious about morality issues. How has his string of lovers affected his
How has his string of lovers affected his personal life? Another question about morality. Yeah.
I remember before he became deputy president, there was a scandal about some girlfriend and someone who eventually became the wife. Tell us more about that. You did the research.
Did everyone get that question? It's landmine. It's fraught with danger. Look, let me start, as a point of departure. When we started investigating at News 24 Mashatile, that loomed very large. And when we write about someone like that, the question is always, is his personal life and his string of lovers, does it have anything to do with us? Should we care? Should we write about that? Should we publicize it? And, we had a debate in our newsroom. How do we approach this? Is it relevant? And in the end, we wrote everything that we could about it because it is relevant because, like Mpumi says, he wants to be head of state. And if you want to be head of state, we need to understand what influences are being brought to bear on you. Now, the fact that he might have had a string of lovers while he was married, per se, probably is no one's business apart from his own. But if those strings of lovers are being maintained by his network of business connections, often people who benefit from state contracts, then it becomes a matter of public interest. Because if you are head of state, but you have a string of lovers who crash a Porsche Cayenne and they have to go to one of your business contacts to have that Porsche Cayenne fixed, that becomes a problem because it means that someone can exert improper influence on the head of state. And that means the head of state might become compromised and might not act in the national interest. So that's where it becomes. So I don't think we should, we certainly, and I don't think I made a moral judgment of him in the book. It's about his conduct in his personal life, which spills over in his conduct or into his public life. And that's where it starts to affect us. So it was a minefield. It was difficult to navigate. In the end, I think it's important that people at least take note of that.
You know, Peter, you remind me, after the Polokwane conference, 2007, I wrote a column about the contradiction in the election of Zuma as president of the ANC because he's a polygamist. But his election was sponsored, well, the Youth League campaigned hard, the Youth League of Julius Malema campaigned hard for Zuma to be elected. Yeah. But one of the main campaigns of the ANC Youth League was one woman, one partner, or one man. Yeah. They slogan like that. Yeah. So then I wrote a column about this contradiction, and I got a call from a certain senior leader of the ANC. What is this got to do with you, young man? Anyway, next question. Yes, I'll come to you. See him because I'll forget.
Who the leader was.
Sugunat wants to ask a question. No, wait, I'll come back to you. Don't abuse your proximity. Yes. Please stand if you don't mind so we can hear.
I just want to ask you a question about whether you think some of the things you've identified are peculiar to our country. Because quite often when people like you write books like this, it makes it sound as if our country is kind of unbelievably immoral. Our politicians are of a particular kind, and that somehow in the rest of the world things aren't that way. Now, in my readings and some of the things that are happening, for example, in the United States right now, the immorality is much bigger, certainly on a bigger scale. The kind of moral decrepitude is probably larger. Doesn't mean that we should justify what our politicians are doing, not at all. What it says to me is, what are we trying to say then if we say politicians must be held accountable? In which country in the world is it possible to hold politicians accountable? Let me just go quickly. The politicians in our country had to raise money in order to stand for election. In other countries, they've got a network of contacts who plow money in. If you look at the way in which that works, basically they're buying politicians. In our country, we brought in BEE, and it was necessary because we had to transform the network of people who had money out there who could support politicians. So the ANC, unfairly in some ways, had to rely on these contacts to allow them to stand for elections. The reality is the system is rotten. It's rotten here, it's rotten there, and if politics can be bought with money, if it is not possible for someone to stand for election without getting some big business person to fund you, it's going to be rotten.
It's a very interesting question.
Very, very difficult question to answer. Look, I think...
No, I'm going to
come to you now. I think, I don't deliver any moral judgment over Mashatile in the book, and I don't think it's my place to do that. What I do think is that we as citizens and as voters and as South Africans need to demand accountability from our politicians. If we don't fight for a system that ensures at least a modicum or a measure of accountability, where politicians know that if they transgress, there will be repercussions for them, be it at the ballot box or in Parliament or any other forum where accountability can be exacted for them, then they will continue on the merry path that they are now, where resource extraction and feathering your personal nest really is the biggest reason for them being in politics. Now, politics the world over is dirty. It's always been dirty. And I think, to Jeff's question earlier, we need to demand more of our leaders. I'm not measuring myself against Trump. I mean, the pictures that we've seen over the last 24 hours of Trump destroying part of the White House to build a ballroom is extraordinary. Now, I don't want to compare us to Trump. I don't want to compare us to the Americans, but I do want to compare us I want to compare us to the ideals that the country set for itself after 1994, to become a better place for everyone, to move beyond the nationalist, racist politics of before 1994. And that's where we should go. The Constitution really holds up these ideals that I think we should work towards. As a working reporter, and Mpumi and I were at that Polokwane conference, which Mpumi was a massive turning point, the biggest turning point, I think, that Sunday afternoon when Mbeki was defeated by Zuma in the rain and the mud. that was the most significant turning point post-1994. And I think it was downhill from there. The ANC became a party of corruption, became a party of extraction, and that's not going to change. But I do think we need to hold our politicians to a higher standard, and the system is corrupt. Parliament's not functioning, oversight's not functioning, but the central node of corruption sits at Luthuli House, and that's where the problem is.
I think they... Yes, please.
I would like to say last word. I appreciate what you said, but consider Paul Mashatile. There are several components. First of all, genetic. Second, education. Third, social. Fourth, environmental. And on top of that, prostitution and corruption. You will never, ever get rid of that in the world.
It's a dirty world we live in, and politics is a dirty environment to function in. And I think, you might comment on this as well. The lure of public resources when you are in a position of executive power has become just enormous for many of these factions. So that's what we need to.
I don't want to comment about that. It sells too close to other things. But I just want to, is a comment, I found it fascinating that, basically the question is whether we should make it acceptable that everywhere in the world, democracy has become a rule
so you just throw
of
money
the
at
lobby,
it.
of the lobby groups, for the lobby groups, by the lobby groups. Yeah. Should it be accepted like that? I think American democracy has been totally hijacked by lobby groups. So that's why there's a whole lot of factions in America. But should we accept it that we're a democracy of lobbyists for the lobby groups and by the lobby groups?
Well, I think we've tried to rein in the influence of big money on elections. The last, when Ramaphosa was elected in 2017, I think they called it the billion rand ANC election because more than R1 billion was spent on buying branches and electing, Cyril Ramaphosa or Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and that's just escalated. Now, after that, legislation was brought in to try and regulate party donations and how parties fund themselves. But in the last 6 months, much of that regulation has been rolled back. And recently, Cyril Ramaphosa signed into a law which almost reversed all of that. So we are in a difficult space where you've got lots of money involved in party elections. Not only the ANC, but the DA as well. Lots of money flowing in from interest groups, vested interests, to try and influence outcomes. How do you change that? Legislation, public pressure, accountability in Parliament, and investigative journalists that can expose that.
Sigonati, no chance.
Who is that person outside? It's none of your business.
No, I'm not going to tell you because you're going to investigate that person.
He's still alive.
But, yes, there's a question.
So I'd like to know your opinion. Why do you think Paul Mashatile has been earmarked to take over and not someone else?
I don't think he's been earmarked. I just think he's very clever in the way in which he's positioned himself over the last 10 years. In 2017, he became Treasurer General. In 2022, he became Deputy President. And in 2023, he became Deputy President of the country. There's no one else at the moment that I can see that can challenge him. Names that are being bandied about includes Fikile Mbalula, which I don't think anyone can take seriously. Nomvula Mokonyane, who is a Mashatile opponent from the East Rand. Senzo Mkhunu, who was part of the mix until very recently, but his problems with the police has now overtaken his presidential ambitions. I think it's pretty clear that he is the front runner at the moment. Ramaphosa has, as I said earlier, over the last 18 months, certainly given him more responsibilities than Ramaphosa was given by Zuma. So at this stage, Mashatile is the clear front runner. He also is very adept in corralling support at branch level. He has reached out to KwaZulu-Natal, which is, you need KZN on your side if you want to be ANC president. He's in the Eastern Cape quite regularly, which is another province that you need if you want to ascend to the top job. So as far as organization is concerned, understanding the organization, of course, he was acting Secretary General when Alex Mafia was suspended a couple of years ago. So he knows how the organization works. He's a gatekeeper, and he'll be able to manipulate it to his advantage. So as far as ANC leadership is concerned, Mashatile, 18 months out from the next elective conference, I think is the clear front runner.
We have another question here.
Your opinion on Patrice Motsepe saying that Panyaza must be the next president?
Wow.
I mean, you say Paul is...
So Panyaza Lesufi is also someone that harbors very significant political ambitions. Part of the strong Gauteng lobby. Someone with his eye on the deputy presidency, as far as I understand. And we've done some work on Panyaza Lesufi. There is some serious questions there about his probity as well. But certainly someone that's close to Mashatile, in the Mashatile orbit, and someone that, if Mashatile moves ahead, Panyaza will probably move in his wake. But certainly not someone that I'd want as head of state.
Thank you.
Patrice, last week at an event of the South African National Editors Forum, said that he won't be standing, which might mean that I will be standing very soon. We don't know. But certainly if the chips are down and there is a strong faction in the ANC that does not want Mashatile, it's quite possible that they might push for Patrice. But he's got no real political experience. I'd be very surprised if he goes that way.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Let me use my privilege of being the facilitator and ask the last question before I urge you all to buy the book. It's there in stock. Please don't leave without a copy. My last question to you, Peter. So, if Paul were to take this as positively, as an advice about what not to do, and then he asks you, Peter, what are the 2 or 3 things I can do as Paul Mashatile for you to write a totally different book? Maybe something that says the Golden Prince. What would be the 2 or 3 things you would say to him? Do the following. Yeah. I might change my perspective.
It's a great question. First and foremost, I think, is fix the criminal justice system. Because if we don't fix the criminal justice system, this country will not survive and this country will not thrive. Yeah. We're going to have to fix the police. We're going to have to fix the Hawks. We're going to have to fix the NPA. That's the very first thing. The second thing is the economy. We're going to have to take away the strictures to economic growth. Our biggest threat is unemployment and inequality. If we don't get that right, we can wish for 1,000 things, but it's not going to work. So fix the criminal justice system, enable the economy to grow, to get people employed. And I think, we're going to have to clear up the mess of the cities, of basic service delivery. People need to be able to live in dignity. We need to get water back into our pipes, electricity, a stable supply of electricity so people can live. So I think service delivery, the criminal justice system, and the economy. 3 big things. But I think if I were to pick one of them, I think fix the criminal justice system first.
All right, keep it up. Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well done, Peter. Congratulations.